I remember when I was about 13, my father came along, he says, here's a book you need to read. It was Marx's Das Kapital. I said, Dad, have you read it? He said, no. So why should I read it? You need to know what other people think.
Tell us about your own faith journey up to this point. You now obviously speak to many people all over the world about Christianity, but where did it all begin for you?
It began for me, and let me say as well how delighted I am to be back in Costa Mesa. And I've enjoyed in the past some marvelous shows with Justin, and I'm just fascinated by what's going to happen in the conversation tonight. But I grew up in Northern Ireland, which isn't always the best start to discuss religion, because it was a divided community and there was a lot of terrorism that was connected in a very complex way to Christianity of both versions, Protestant and Catholic. But the important thing was that my parents were very unusual for that kind of cultural context. They were Christian, convinced Christians, but they weren't sectarian. And that was very unusual. My father had a small business. We lived in a small town, 15,000 or so. And he tried to employ people from both sides of the community. Now, why did he do that? I once asked him, I said, Dad, it's so risky. And he was bombed for doing this. My brother nearly lost his life. And he said, look, he said, I believe that every person, whatever they believe, is of infinite value because they're made in the image of God, going back to the Hebrew scriptures. And therefore, I will employ across the community. And that has stuck with me. And it's been very important when you're discussing, as I often do, with people that do not share my worldview. That always comes to my mind. Here's a person in front of me, and it relates to what you were saying about freedom. I would connect with freedom, value. That here's something outside of my parents that gave every human being dignity and value. That was point number one. The second thing was that they allowed me to think. Now, Northern Ireland's often associated with religious bigotry, extreme fundamentalism, all this kind of thing. And my parents were not highly educated, but they really gave me space. So my first encounter with Christianity was not mind closing, it was mind expanding. And I remember when I was about 13, my father came along, he says, here's a book you need to read. It was Marx's Das Kapital. I said, Dad, have you read it? He said, no. So why should I read it? You need to know what other people think. I never forget that. It was a set of compass bearing. The third point is their Christianity was credible, morally credible. They actually lived what they believed. So in that sense, I had a hugely privileged background that didn't compress me into a narrow-minded, bigoted person. And it was noticeable when I went to Cambridge in 1962, not 1862. I know I look old, but when I went to Cambridge in 1962, many of my contemporaries from Ireland, the moment they got out of the country, that was the end of any Christianity, because they'd never made it their own. They'd never thought about it. But I'd been encouraged to think about it. And that sort of set the compass bearing. There's one further point that really shaped my life. I was challenged in Cambridge very early on by a student at table at night. And he asked, do you believe in God? And then he said, oh, sorry. I shouldn't have asked you that. You're Irish. All you Irish believe in God and you fight about it. Now, I'd heard that many times, but somehow it was different. And I thought, gosh, yes, I've never really met atheists. In Ireland, people divide into Protestant atheists and Catholic atheists. But they're not really real atheists. Right. So I thought, what I'm going to do is to start today and befriend people, befriend them. That's important, that do not share my worldview. And I'd spent my whole life doing it. So that really sets the scene, I think.
So Nietzsche famously declared God is dead. Now, he may have been a bit premature in that, but maybe he's finally, his thoughts are coming true in 21st century West, because we are living in an increasingly post-Christian age, people say. Increasingly, the number of people who tick the census box that says none, no religious affiliation is going up and so on. I mean, you're engaging with this kind of demographic all the time on your show, Dave. What's your feeling? Do you feel like people are genuinely less religious now? To what extent are some of those friends that you made early on in your show, people like Sam Harris and other well-known atheists, responsible for people moving away from the religious bearings that they once had?
So obviously, I don't want to speak for Sam or any of those guys. What I have found in the conversations that I've had with non-believers and with believers is that at a micro level, you can be a non-believer and be absolutely moral and decent and good and a productive member of society and all of those things, as I believe those couple people that I mentioned are. What I think is becoming the problem, and I think this is really where Jordan Peterson hit on something, is that societies can't organize around that it can sort of work for a while. And there's, most of the things that I believe in, and I talk about the individual all the time and why I believe that classical liberalism is the best sort of framework for a political system that we should have. They almost can't exist without that underlying bedrock. And so your question sort of gets to what I was saying earlier, which is that the reason that the secular world feels so out of control right now, I mean, just yesterday, I'm sure some of you guys saw this, CNN did this equality town hall last night, and it was like, everyone has to mention their gender pronouns, and you have to admit that there are more than two genders, and all of these things that we know these conversations are not being had. There are settled science debates that went on for a long time that we know what facts are. And yet we find, because this has now become untethered to anything other than how you feel, that now everything is up for grabs. And that's why it sort of feels like that there's something sort of godless happening here or something like that. Now, trust me, that is a hard thing for someone like me to say. As someone that really my beliefs really are rooted in the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment thinkers. And this is a real debate amongst people who talk about the Enlightenment. Could they have done it? Could they have reformed religions and burst liberalism in a positive way forward without some religious belief behind it? I don't know the answer to that exactly. I don't know that we'll ever really know the answer to that. But I would say that the reason I first said that I'm happy to be here with you guys is that in the last year, where now I virtually only get invited to events by conservative groups or libertarian groups for sure, but groups on the right, let's say, but I often get invited to churches. I often get invited to places of faith. Now, I know we can go through a litany of political disagreements that we may or may not have, and I absolutely know that everyone in this room would be happy to do that. And there would be nobody fighting, there would be nobody screaming. We could explore those ideas as far as we can, and then we would put it down and either agree to disagree, or maybe we'd move each other one way or another, and that would be wonderful. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I don't think it's a coincidence that you guys here, and that generally believers right now are more tolerant. They are. It's just the reality. The people, give yourselves a round of applause. That really is true. Who are the most intolerant people in society right now? It's the people that are constantly telling you how tolerant they are. That's the irony. It's the people that tell you you're a bunch of racists and bigots and homophobes and the rest of it. And that's the real bizarre flip that we have happening in society. And I think that is linked to either, however you want to phrase it, either a post-Christian world or a post-Judeo-Christian world or a postmodern world, however you want to define that.
I mean, to what extent do you agree with Dave's analysis there of what's going on, especially, I suppose, at that academic level and in terms of the kind of conversations now that you are and aren't allowed to have almost when it comes to these issues?
I think it's a pretty accurate analysis.
If you're looking for more honest and thoughtful conversations about spirituality instead of nonstop yelling, check out our spirituality playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, check out our full episode playlist. They're all right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.